When we think about university research, I think most of us think of science and technology, but we have to remind ourselves that research going on at universities is much broader than that. And our next researcher comes from a different perspective. She comes from Ontario's newest university, Algoma, which is in Sault Ste. Marie, in case you didn't know that. And Gayle Broad studies concepts like social economy and social entrepreneurs. And it's interesting, I was talking with Gayle before, and she spent 25 years before going back to school to study this area as a community organizer. And we were talking about what would the community organizer be called today? And it would be called a social entrepreneur. But it was interesting, all those years that she was doing that work, that term wasn't even invented. So it's a real new branch of research. We do tend to think of entrepreneurialism as something that only belongs to the business world, but many social issues, things like homelessness or activism, are affected by the principles and concepts that parallel the world of traditional economics. And so Gayle studies the ways that these social principles can enrich or impoverish a community. So for Gayle Broad, what matters now is how communities can be a force for social innovation. Please help me welcome Gayle to the stage.
Thanks very much, Pia. Is that okay? Can people hear? Yeah? Today's social and economic issues are really complex, in my view, and the solutions require a lot of creativity on the part of the people in the communities surrounding them and that are coming to deal with them. In fact, people that are working to resolve some of these really complex issues need a number of characteristics, and many of these characteristics are very similar to the kinds of characteristics that we associate with the people that are highly successful in business. So they need to be risk takers, they need to have very diverse perspectives and be able to think right outside the box. They need to be people that are very flexible, that they can change and move and be very agile. Of particular interest to me right now in the work that I'm doing is that they need to be people who can combine business skills, who can take the skills of business that we need, of looking at the bottom line closely, of figuring out how to allocate human resources and so on, and combine those of a successful entrepreneur with the social conscience of a community activist. And those people need to be team players. They need to work in communities, and they need to be able to find ways of working in very diverse communities. And a lot more. They need a lot more than that. In the short time that we have together right now, I'm going to give you just one example of the complexity that I'm talking about, the multidisciplinary issues that are facing the world, that are very concrete problems that we're trying to solve, and the innovative solutions that a community of people can design to address those issues. And I want to conclude my remarks with why communities are, I view, a force for social innovation. I work mostly in communities across Northern Ontario, and if you've ever had the chance to fly or drive across Northern Ontario, you know that in the region there's at least two things that you'll remember. One is that it takes a very long time to drive across Northern Ontario. It can be 2 or 3 days depending on the speed at which you drive and how many animals you hit along the way. And the other thing that is very striking is the amount of water that we have. The water in Northern Ontario has, obviously a tremendous resource to us, but it also produces a lot of hydroelectric power that the rest of us and the rest of the world really needs to power all of our computers and our smartphones and all of those things. But the vast distances means that there's thousands of kilometers of power line corridors going through forests in Northern Ontario. These corridors have to be kept clear of trees that will interfere with the power lines. And we're talking, as I say, thousands of kilometers. So the problem that we're dealing with, or one of the problems that we see in the north, is keeping those power corridors clear of the trees. And that's often meant destruction of habitat for both flora and fauna, causing problems for species at risk. And it's done through the spraying of toxic chemicals, which is not good for any of us, certainly not good for our environment, and the use of heavy equipment going on and basically logging the areas underneath them. So we lose certain species of trees, but we also lose certain species of animals and birds and a variety of different species. So how do we go about solving this problem? Well, we have a group of botanists that were led by a woman named Sue Meads. And she connected with a group of business people from a few power companies in the north. And together they decided that they would identify low-growing plants that are indigenous to northern Ontario and plant them in the corridor. Now that sounds like a pretty simple solution. But, well, you just need to travel over a few thousand kilometers, identify all the different plants and the different types of terrain that you need to plant them in, the soil and the habitat of the corridor, and start planting the right type of bushes and short trees so that they don't grow tall enough to interfere. A big job, but maybe you don't think that's too complex. I mean, you know, that can be solved. But then there's another whole layer that comes on top of that. And the trouble with a lot of these species is that they only grow in northern Ontario. And they're not commonly cultivated in nurseries because there's no demand, there's no market for wild plants that are indigenous to northern Ontario. I suspect that not too many of you have milkweeds growing in your gardens. They're not a plant that you might necessarily want to grow in your gardens, but they're really essential for the habitat of monarch butterflies, for example. So again, we're talking thousands of kilometers across an area that has tremendous differences in the terrain itself as well as in the climate across the north. So the next question becomes, how can we get the seeds and grow the plants so that this corridor remediation can actually take place and we can actually reduce the level of toxicity in our environment and you know, improve the communities and the way that we live. So this is where social entrepreneurship really kicks in. The first team, composed of the botanists and the business folks from the power companies, began searching for people who would actually know how to do this, how to collect seeds, store them, and so on. And some of that knowledge is knowledge that is inherent within First Nation communities. It's called traditional ecological knowledge. But that knowledge also had to be matched up with the knowledge that the botanists had in order to make the whole thing, feasible. And it also needed to be matched up with the business of actually making this an endeavor that would be worthwhile for the people. So the team found two different nurseries, one which was located at a small First Nation community and the other one located in a Francophone community. In the Francophone community, it was a cooperative that was developed in the early 1980s by a group of women who found that it was really hard to get jobs in communities that were primarily based in logging. So the need to address the environmental impact of power line corridors and remediating the habitat for species at risk, reducing and eliminating herbicide use, has led to the creation of a market for low-growing plants that are indigenous to northern Ontario. As I say, this has required scientists to work with First Nations, to work with Francophone communities, and the non-scientists involved in this whole project have to learn the skills in seed collection and storage and seedling growth. It's required the communities involved to learn lots of different business skills because even though there's thousands of kilometers to plant, that's still not going to be enough to really support nurseries doing this kind of work. So now they're looking to highway developments and mine remediation sites as a market that they can expand into. So the goal of both the First Nation and La Maison Verte, which is the women's cooperative, is to create jobs and alleviate some of the disadvantages that First Nation peoples and women often find in the job market. So how does all this combination of things link into communities being socially innovative and the development of social entrepreneurs? What our research is showing is that communities can be a molding force in supporting or in not supporting socially innovative solutions to some of the most pernicious social problems. Communities can play a very important role, particularly in supporting the development of young social entrepreneurs. And they're the next generation of people who will be the catalyst for change. As Pia mentioned, I spent 25 years trying to do this work, but it's time for me to pass this on to some others. So thanks to some funding from the Trillium Foundation, last week in Sault Ste. Marie, we brought together about 40 people from across Northern Ontario, many of them young people, most of them young people, but we also brought some more experienced people who are all engaged in changing the face of Northern Ontario, and I think in changing the face of the world. One was a young First Nations woman who's introduced environmentally safe cleaning products to not only her own community, but to nearby towns, and created work, again, not only for herself, but for several other young people in the process. Another was a young man who's helped numerous youth deal with addictions through the creation of a youth drop-in center, and he's funded that by developing a recording studio and a coffee shop. Another has been working with youth all over the world in developing self-confidence and self-esteem through a social enterprise. These young people are dealing with the after effects of things like residential schools and 300 years of colonization of First Nations people. They're finding ways to work across cultures and linguistic barriers to break down the silos that prevent communities from sharing their knowledge with one another. They're finding ways to solve environmental problems, social problems, and building a whole new kind of an economy that is inclusive of the people that are often left behind, all at the same time. So how can communities support these young people in doing these exciting things and being and becoming real social innovators and social entrepreneurs? The young people have told us that there's a number of concrete actions communities can take. We can help them create peer networks, provide spaces for them to meet other young social entrepreneurs, learn from each other. In other words, we can create a real learning community for them where they can share and develop those skills together. They've told us that we can help them find mentors, people that are experienced and are successfully doing this work. They told us that we can provide them with concrete skills and training, with investment advice, and much more. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next 3 years, is researching that. I see Pia's coming up. If we can make that happen all the time, if we can make it happen really frequently, not just sometimes, then we're going to start addressing some of those really big issues like poverty, social exclusion, and cleaning up the mess we've been making on our planet. We think this is research that matters, and it matters now.